Hello, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And of course, one of the big burning issues of the day is foreign policy. And Sheldon, I was absolutely astounded to read the editorial by the Washington Post on Sunday. This is one of the most phenomenal things I've ever read, in large part because of how ludicrous it is. I mean, it's absolutely astoundingly ludicrous. The title of the article is "America's Global Role Deserves Better Support from Obama." And what the Post is doing is lamenting the fact that 47% of Americans under the latest polls want a less active role for the U.S. government. Now, that's not to say they've become libertarians in any sense where they would support a total non-interventionist foreign policy, but they're saying enough's enough given all these disasters that the U.S. government has produced in the last several years. And the Post is taking them to task, saying this would be an absolute disaster, that here in the very first sentence, they say the U.S. must continue to serve as, and these are their words, global security guarantor. Global security guarantor? I mean, where is the U.S. government guaranteed security? And that this imposes a price on the American people that we've got to continue bearing. And then the whole editorial is how the U.S. should not go isolationist. They combine the military role with the global trade war. I mean, this to me is perfect way for us to address the libertarian paradigm on foreign policy. What do you think?
Well, the poll was very mixed. 47% said they wanted a less active foreign policy, but 55% said they wanted Obama to stand up to our enemies and stand up for our principles. So there's a little bit of schizophrenia there. It's hard, like you say, it's hardly a libertarian position. I think there's just some weariness with how long Afghanistan has gone on. And, Iraq went on for a while. But the U.S., the administration, they're getting, quote unquote, smarter about this and not talking about sending troops places, right? We have drones doing the work that people on the ground used to do. So if they keep that up, it'll fade from America's the minds of Americans, and they won't care so much if it's just basically flying robots killing people. I don't think people know how much damage U.S. foreign policy has been doing over the last. I'm just talking now back to the Bush administration, the Bush II administration. We could go back much further, of course, but just looking at the most recent history, they have no conception of how the Iraq society was destroyed by the United States military, beginning in 91, but then all the way through, especially in the 2003 to 2011 war. I was watching a baseball game yesterday, and they were, at the seventh inning stretch. Of course, they were going to honor the military, and they had one representative there who was a veteran of Iraq, the Iraq War, and so they introduced him. And they said, let's everybody honor the people who fought in Iraq and elsewhere. And then they played, God Bless America. And I remember saying out loud, pretty much to myself, do Americans have any idea what they've done to that society? I mean, it's sectarian violence is raging to this day. Terrible things going on. Millions of refugees, a million dead. It's terrible, terrible things, and here they are saluting a symbol of that war as if it was some great moment for the United States. The word Iraq should bring shame to every American heart, and so people don't even know what they're talking about. So I don't even know what basis they answer the poll questions.
Well, yeah, and the fact that the Washington Post, I mean, they know better. They know the history of U.S. interventionism, and you mentioned Iraq, and here the Post has said that America has to continue serving as global security guarantor. And then in the last paragraph, this is just as phenomenal, that Americans will indeed pay a heavy price and bear heavy burdens to secure the survival and success of liberty. Now, if you put those things together and you apply them, say, to Iraq, which you just brought up, How in the world can anyone honestly suggest that the U.S. government has secured liberty and security in Iraq? I mean, here, and as you point out, how can anybody be glorifying the troops for what they did in this country? One of the things that I find fascinating is how troops, say, well, I'm really proud that I was protecting the rights and freedoms of the American people. What? I mean, Sheldon, sometimes I think that we're like that story, The Emperor's New Clothes, by Hans Christian Andersen, that the emperor's walking around naked, but everybody says, oh, look at the Emperor's New Clothes and look at the Emperor's New Clothes, and you're supposed to believe it because everybody's saying it, and then along come us libertarians and we say, hey, that's his birthday suit he's wearing. And that's particularly the case with Iraq. The U.S. was the aggressor there. Iraq was the defending nation. This business about, they had the WMDs that the U.S. had delivered to them in the 80s, it was, to me, just a lie. But even if you give them the benefit of the doubt and say it was an honest mistake, certainly the U.S. didn't apologize for it. They didn't say, well, we're getting out now that we didn't find the WMDs, which showed that the WMD thing was just a big sham. And then they go in there to say, now that we're here and we haven't found the WMDs, we're going to bring democracy and freedom to Iraq. Well, that place is just a hellhole. They killed any number of Iraqis. The upper limit never mattered. And the place is an absolute hellhole. And the best evidence is that not one member of Congress would dare take his family on vacation there. And the Washington Post, can they honestly sit there and say the U.S. government is the guarantor of security and liberty? How do they reconcile that with Iraq?
The Washington Post is the house organ of the ruling elite. I mean, that clears up any mystery about it. They defend power, and that's basically what they're in business to do. So they represent the voice of the ruling elite to anyone who cares to read it. So you have to keep that in mind when you read this stuff. I'm as flabbergasted about it as you are, because they didn't contend with any of the real issues, and there's also a lot of just factually incorrect things in that editorial. They refer to America's traditional temptation with isolationism, but there was never much in the way of any kind of isolationism. By that we mean non-intervention. Even between World War I and World War II, when Republican senators prevented the U.S. from joining the League of Nations, that wasn't out of any isolationist sense. That was a defense of unilateralism against multilateralism. Henry Cabot Lodge, who led that effort in the Senate, was no advocate of non-interventionism. And of course, they conflate isolationism with non-interventionism, as if most advocates of non-interventionism have no desire to be isolated from the world. They do want trade, and they want other sorts of exchanges, travel, and scientific and intellectual exchanges, cultural exchange. I don't know of any. I guess there's just some corner of the political spectrum where people want to close themselves off from the rest of the world, but that's certainly not what we're talking about. Trading, you got to be careful about, because when they did praise globalization, and they said that the American the people polled supported globalization, but trade today and historically has always been something spearheaded by government. When they talk about globalization, they don't mean laissez-faire and free trade. They mean government opening up markets, government entering into bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements. Obama was just in Asia to talk to Japan and other countries about trade deals. So they're just doing the bidding of big companies. That's what the Export-Import Bank does. Even most free traders today are not advocates of free markets. Sad.
Yeah, they make the standard mistake of conflating the U.S. government and the private sector as if it's all just one amorphous whole. So when they condemn isolationism, they say, oh, well, we can't afford to close off trade with the world, and we can't afford to have our troops not being able to invade other countries and intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries. But as we libertarians know, there is a distinction between the private sector and the government sector. And so what we advocate is bringing all the troops home, non-interventionism, dismantle the empire of bases, but liberate the American people, liberate the private sector to interact with the people of the world. So you don't even need trade agreements. Just liberate the American people to travel to Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, all these other countries that they got sanctions. Unilaterally get rid of all the trade restrictions, the protectionism, the privilege deals for American farmers and producers and so forth. So you liberate the private sector. How can that be considered isolationist when you're saying let the American people interact with the people of the world? But you bring the empire back and you dismantle it. That's what's called non-intervention. They make the mistake of conflating the two by saying, oh, well, if you bring the troops home, that means you've got to erect all these walls around trade of America. That's absolute nonsense. How can they not see that that's just pure nonsense, Sheldon?
Well, historically, and I'm talking about American history as well as other countries, that conflation is the default position. We're the radicals. We have to school people on this. The default position is that when it comes to trade, the government clears the way for the private companies, and often it's especially connected companies. So we're the ones introducing a new, as far as they're concerned, element. And what they would regard as a foreign element, because when they think of isolationism, they do identify that with government no longer spearheading open trade. And of course, we don't want government spearheading open trade either, but they think that means there won't be trade with the rest of the world. So we really are at ground one, square one with such people to explain that trade carries on and there's an orderliness to markets, even world markets, that's not provided by the state. Because they don't understand that. Conflation is the right word. They do meld those two things together, and it's a totally foreign idea to them that the two things can be separated, state and market.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that the Pentagon sees their role in this too, in terms of advancing the interests of American businesses, and we saw this especially in Latin America. Throughout the history of U.S. relations with that part of the world. Remember Guatemala, where the CIA goes in there and secretly engineers the ouster of the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, ostensibly because he was a, quote, communist. But lo and behold, it turns out that United Fruit Company, where a lot of congressmen, a lot of U.S. officials owned stock, was having part of its lands nationalized in Guatemala. And so, of course, that was one of the real reasons they went down there and intervened. And this is part of that legacy of government involvement with business, which taints us because the left often says, oh, that's capitalism. And that's their understanding of capitalism, where the U.S. government and the business community get together. What we're saying is, you go to Guatemala, you're on your own. If somebody starts to take your property away from you down there, you take your chances. You can't expect the U.S. government to invade or affect a regime change on your behalf. And so I think you're right. We've got to continue drawing this line so that as the number of Americans are looking at U.S. foreign policy, Vietnam, total waste of American life. I think most everybody acknowledges that. The communists did not take over America, even though the communists won in Vietnam. And you've got this thing with Afghanistan. You've got, which is another hellhole. Nobody would dare take his family on vacation to Afghanistan. You've got Iraq. You've got the whole history regime change operations, Iran, 1953. Look at the relations today. They're directly rooted in what happened in 1953 in the CIA's regime change operation there. So how in the world can anybody look at this legacy of interventionism and say, well, we've got to stay on this same road. Americans have a big burden to bear here. We've got to keep securing liberty and security in these foreign countries. Really? Where have you done that? That's my question to them.
Well, I suppose the move they would make, and so we would need to answer it, is that think about how much worse things would be if the U.S. Hadn't been involved in the world, U.S. government, all that time. They would say, look, sea lanes are open. I'm just playing devil's advocate now and giving their answer, because I think we need to be prepared to respond to that. They would say, the sea lanes are open, trade does occur. We don't have ships routinely being, hijacked or pirated, or yes, you're looking at things that have gone wrong sometimes, and that's regrettable. But you're not looking at the bigger picture, the essential order that does exist because the U.S. is a de facto traffic cop, policeman, world government, basically. That's what I think they'd say in response, and I think we have an answer to that, but we should answer it, and we should pretend that question's not there. We should anticipate an answer before they even ask it.
Well, obviously, but it's very difficult to say what would have been the case when they have already done what they did. It just becomes imaginary, and so I really think that the real question is, what should be the role of the U.S. government in international affairs? Should it be intervening? Even if there were guaranteeing safety or security, like they say, or bringing liberty. I would argue that the price that Americans are paying, even if they were successful in some of these regime change operations, and from their standpoint they are successful because they install pro-U.S. dictators, is the price that we here pay at home. Not only in terms of a debased currency, out of control spending for the warfare state, but our own liberty. This is what the Washington Post never addresses in there, is our own freedom. That all this interventionism has given rise to the war on terrorism, the anger and hatred that where people have the incentive to come and do bad things to us. That then is used as the excuse to have the power to assassinate us, even here on American soil, but especially if we happen to be traveling overseas, with impunity. And they don't have to go through any kind of due process to kill us anymore or to round us up and torture us. They now have this power. And the federal judiciary, which has lain supine in this whole war on terrorism, Cold War attitude, they have upheld this. How can that possibly be reconciled with the principles of a free society? So what the Post is not recognizing is not only are you destroying people overseas, killing them, who knows how many in Afghanistan, who knows how many in Iraq, who knows how many in Vietnam, but the total certainly goes into the millions. But look what you're doing to our country. They have fundamentally changed the nature of our country and cost us our freedom and our economic viability here at home.
I suppose they would chalk that up as the price of freedom. I suppose that's what they say. And of course, they could say, yes, Iraq, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. We're not saying everything that's happened is right and good, but they still would want to defend the general framework. What they don't understand is spontaneous order. I mean, we've talked about this on several occasions. And, one of our jobs is to convince people. I assume the editorial board of the Washington Post is pretty much a lost cause. I don't think we'll convince them, but we can convince other people, the spectators who read that stuff, that maybe also come in contact with our work. We need to convince them that the order that we observe in society, as Payne said, arises bottom up. It's a bottom up emergent process. It's not an imposed top down, because that's the way the Post sees it. If there's going to be order in the world, regarding trade and other things, they think the U.S. needs to be imposing it from the top down, as if the U.S. is the de facto world government. That's really what they're saying. And we have to show that the most robust order and the order that respects liberty is always an emergent bottom-up order coming out of people's activities, respect for other people, realizing their interests lie in social cooperation and exchange, and there's no reason why that can't happen across so-called national boundaries. If it can happen within a country, there's no reason why it can't happen between and among countries if governments would get out of the way.
Yeah, and that's not to say that bad things don't happen in the world. Of course they happen. They happen in life. You may have one regime that's got a tyrannical government. People are suffering under that tyranny. You have oppression overseas. You have famines, many of which are caused by government policies, socialist policies. People are starving to death. But I mean, that's why I love that great talk that John Quincy Adams gave to the Congress in 1821 to celebrate the 4th of July. Anybody that wants to read it, just Google "In Search of Monsters to Destroy." And Adams is saying, look, there are lots of monsters in the world. No doubt about that. There still are monsters in the world. But the U.S. government is not going to go abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. There's any number of monsters. Because, he points out, if the government ever assumes that authority, which it has, that's what changed in the 20th century, it's going to change the nature of American society. That when you suggested that that's the price of freedom, I couldn't help but laugh, because the attitude is, the loss of freedom here at home is the price of freedom. And that's really what they've done. As Adam said, when you adopt this role, you're going to change the nature of American society. The government's going to become the dictatress of the world. Well, the U.S. government has become the dictator of the world, dictating to this country what it's going to do here, what's going to do there, what's going to do there. And when they don't obey, they invade, they affect regime change operations. And in the process, they have engendered so much anger and animosity toward our country that then they come and take away our freedom with the power to assassinate us, power to round us up. And these powers are now there. All they got to do is take the sword out of the sheath in an emergency, and they're ready. I mean, there's no more talk of, hey, this is not constitutional anymore. The federal courts have held it's constitutional, and that's all rooted in U.S. interventionism.
Yeah, and I would say that the ethic of interventionism, the imperial mindset, really stretches very far back. Adam says a lot of good things in that speech, but he unfortunately left a lot of things out and didn't say quite enough. We can discuss his speech at another time, but it's certainly good policy not to be going abroad in search of monsters or going abroad for any other purpose that the U.S. government may have in mind. Searching for monsters is not the only lure for the U.S. government to go abroad. It can be doing it purely for its own political interests, geopolitical interests, and for the interests of well-connected companies, and that wouldn't really qualify as going abroad looking for monsters, but rather going abroad looking to shore up your own political economic interests. So we have to be a little careful about that. There can be many reasons to go abroad, and Adam's only you really addressed one of them. But again, I think we're back at square one with such people like the Washington Post editorial board, because it doesn't even compute when you suggest that conceptually the state and the economy can be separated. Even conceptually, they don't even understand that. It's like we're speaking a different language.
Yeah, they really just assume. Seems to me that one of the roles of the U.S. government is to advance the interests of U.S. businesses. And so when you see President Obama or the State Department going overseas to negotiate with foreign leaders, you always see them talking in terms of, well, we want you to drop your trade barriers over here on this sector because our farmers would like to sell into that sector in your country, or this American business would like to sell automobiles into your country. I mean, it's like they're the representative of the corporation or the business interests, and that's been appointed to go and handle their interests. Well, as you point out, none of that's necessary. All you've got to do is unilaterally drop your own trade restrictions, your own tariffs, your own subsidies, your own little privileges for your business sector, and then just tell the business sector you're on your own. You go and negotiate your own deals overseas. If you encounter a protectionist country, you got to deal with that. But the idea, Sheldon, is what I'm suggesting is what we ought to be doing is spending our time establishing a free society here in the United States. What better way to lead the world of freedom than to make your own society a model of freedom? And the other thing I wanted to say is, which is so ludicrous about this editorial, is I read the part where it says that America will indeed bear a heavy price and bear heavy burdens to secure the survival and success of liberty. Now, how in the world do they reconcile that with the U.S. support of Egypt, which has just ousted its democratically elected president? They have propped up this military machine over the last 30 some odd years, the national security state apparatus, for this prime purpose, the specific purpose of maintaining order and stability and ousting a democratically elected president that may not be pro-U.S. And that it has all these mock trials now where they're sentencing, I think it's up to about 1,300 people to death in the killing of one policeman. I mean, there is no way that regime can be considered, consistent with the principles of freedom. And apparently that goes right over the head of the heads of the people on the editorial board at the Washington Post, along with all the other dictatorial regimes that the U.S. has aligned with and supported. We can go back to Saddam Hussein. Remember how it was so necessary to intervene, to invade Iraq, to save the world from Saddam Hussein. He was the partner and ally of the U.S. government throughout the 1980s when he was fighting Iran. So how do they possibly get this into their head that the foreign policy of the United States is devoted to the preservation of liberty when we see time and time again the U.S. ousting democratically elected presidents, Chile, Pinochet and Allende, Guatemala, Arbenz, and the military dictatorships, Iran, the Shah of Iran, Egypt today, before Pakistan. How in the world? Do they really live on the same planet that we live on, Sheldon?
Well, I think there's a very simple answer to it. They don't mean the freedom of the Egyptian people or the freedom of Iraqi people or any other group of people in the world. They don't even mean the freedom and security of the American people. They mean the freedom and security of the ruling elite. It needs the freedom to act, and so it needs friendly regimes, friendly to it, not to the American people. And that safeguards their security. That's what this is about. Look, this is a good old liberal class analysis, classical liberal class analysis. There's us and there's them. There are the rulers, which are people in the government, but also all their clients outside of it that are living off the taxpayers in various ways, the military-industrial complex, most obvious. And then there's the rest of us who produce the taxes. So you have the tax eaters, the tax consumers, and you have the tax producers, the taxpayers, us. And yes, they're looking out for their freedom of action and their security. So it all makes perfect sense once you add those phrases. There's no mystery about it whatsoever. And like I said, the Washington Post is the voice of the ruling elite. They're very honest. Except they need to throw in that phrase, the ruling class. They need to throw that phrase in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in the process, they end up really isolating the American people in many instances with the walls that they build around the country to protect us from the enemies that they themselves are producing with their unleashed federal power. We see that, Berlin type wall on the southern border of the United States. You see the immigration wars. You see the trade restrictions, the embargoes, the never-ending sanctions. It's all designed to isolate the American people, make them energy independent and so forth, when we libertarians look at it the exact opposite. Rein in the federal government and liberate the American people, unleash the creative forces of the American people. I mean, my experience has been, Sheldon, that people all over the world, they love the American people. And they love our values. They love our principles. They really hate the U.S. government and its imperialist empire, interventionist foreign policy. And this is what people like at the Post can't get. Because as you say, everything's talking about the quote freedom of the U.S. government to do whatever it wants in the world, and in that process produce crises. Because let's face it, crises are the coin of the realm. When people start getting uneasy like this, 47% saying a less activist foreign policy. Okay, they may not be with us here, but at least now they're open to listening to us libertarians by saying, hey, let's go all the way here with a principled foreign policy. That's got to make people in Washington extremely nervous. And it's also obviously making the Washington Post extremely nervous, because it's very possible that when people are now starting to doubt this pro-interventionist foreign policy, that they're going to start listening to us libertarians and saying, here's the real crux of the problem, here's the real solution to it.
Well, sure. I think they may be worried that there is some isolationist mood coming in, to use the term they like to use, mood coming in after these long wars, and lots of they're hearing news stories about veterans who are in such lousy shape and 22 or 25 a day, killing themselves and wandering the streets and things like that. So that could make people for a time be very nervous about any new adventure. And we saw that with when the Syria strike was being proposed by Obama and Kerry. People didn't like the idea. Luckily, also, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't like the idea, so it didn't happen. But, things can change. The so-called Vietnam syndrome eventually ended, let enough time pass. Also, like I said, they've gotten smarter. They're doing things with special ops and drones. Not very visible. You're not sending thousands of troops. And, that doesn't yield a lot of American casualties, which is what Americans tend to care about, not the casualties on the other side. And so if you do that for enough time, people, I think, will unfortunately go back to sleep on this issue and let give the ruling class the privacy it so desires.
Well, possibly, but the other side is that I think people are finally starting to draw the link between U.S. foreign policy and the anger and hatred that manifests itself in terrorist counterstrikes. And Ron Paul brought that up in the 2008 debate. He says they came over here on 9/11 because we were over there, the government was over there killing them. And that was really the start of the Ron Paul campaign. And so if people start figuring this out, then all of a sudden the drone assassinations, they draw the link that the more people you're killing over there, the less safe we are here because you're using that as an excuse to protect us from the terrorists and so forth. And now they got this new crisis that with Russia and the NATO expansion and so forth. So, I mean, it's in their interest to produce these crises. And I think as people start to look through that and see through it and say, oh, my gosh, it's their interventionism that the Post says is for freedom and security and so forth that is making us here at home less free and less prosperous, not to mention the people who are bearing the brunt of this overseas. Then I think we got a shot at making some real progress at establishing a free society here at home. And anyway, that's the show for today. That's our libertarian angle. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.